thing, I change my titles all the time. Basically, I'm talking about you know, the same general subject, but so I've been fooling with this one, restoring nature by restoring food webs at home. That seems a little ponderous to me, so I'm thinking about 50 Shades of Green. So think about that. If that works for you, let me know. What is that bird?
Beautiful.
It is a trogon. More specifically, it's a quetzal, resplendent quetzal. It's an endangered species in the forests of Central America, and it's endangered because it has a very, very specific diet. If you don't have fruits of the wild avocado tree, you don't have resplendent quetzals. And unfortunately, we've cut down most of the wild avocado trees. So we figured out if you want quetzals, you have to plant wild avocado trees, and that's what these young folks are doing here. Fortunately, those trees grow pretty quickly. They reach the stage at which they fruit in not too many years, and it's starting to look better for the future of resplendent quetzals. But that same conservation scenario is repeated time and time again in the tropics. If you want to have great green macaws, you have to have mountain almond trees, because that's the only tree they will nest in. And unfortunately, their future's not so bright. There's not very many birds left, and it takes 150 years for mountain almond trees to reach the stage where they will use them. If we want to save jaguars, we have to have particular species of palms. Why palms? Because they make palm nuts, and that happens to be the favorite food of peccaries, and that happens to be the favorite food of jaguars. You don't have healthy jaguar populations without peccaries. So what we're illustrating here is that specialization, particularly specialization focused on food webs, is the rule in the natural world. It's not the exception, and it always starts with plants. Now, most people think that you get all of your specialized relationships in the tropics, because you hear so much about all those specializations in the tropics, but we actually have a great deal of specialization up here in the temperate zone, and some of the most specialized relationships that have ever occurred occur right in our yards. This is one of them. This is a bola spider. It's a female hanging from a river birch leaf in my yard. And you can tell why she's called a bola spider. She drops a single strand of silk, and puts one little sticky glob of glue on the end. Now, she doesn't swing it over her head like that, but she does go fishing with it. She lowers it and raises it and lowers it. And the first time I watched her do that, I told her, "You're not going to catch me." Because that's the way I used to fish, and I didn't catch her. But about 15 seconds later, a moth flew in and got stuck on her little sticky glob of glue, and she reeled it in and laid her eggs on it. Now, what I didn't know at the time is that that was not an accident. She was releasing the sex pheromone for that particular species of moth. That guy's a male. He flew in thinking she was a female. She is a female, but she's the wrong kind. So that was the end of him. And it turns out that every species of bola spider mimics the sex pheromone of one particular species of moth. So you can have bola spiders in your yard if you have the host plant that supports larval development of that particular species of moth. Otherwise, you don't have them. This is Phlox tubericata. It's a very common spring ephemeral in our yards, and it spreads readily from seed if it is pollinated. And if you look at the structure of those flowers, the entrance to that corolla is extremely narrow there. I have watched native bees land on these flowers and try to get their tongues into them. They can't do it. It's too small. So who is pollinating our phlox? Well, it turns out it's day-flying sphinx moths. With those long linear tongues there, they sink them deep into the flower, pull them out, and they're covered with pollen, then they fly to another flower. And if you don't have day-flying sphinx moths, most of your phlox go unpollinated. That is a snowberry clearwing. It's one of 3 species of day-flying sphinx moths in our yard. And we can have snowberry clearwing adults if we have snowberry clearwing larvae, and we can have snowberry clearwing larvae if we have their host plant, which is coral honeysuckle, the native host plant. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Even animals we don't think of as having specialized relationships with plants actually do. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Could be the black-capped chickadee. They're doing pretty much the same thing. These birds, of course, are seed eaters all winter long, and we think of them as seed eaters. That's what we put our bird feeders out for. But when it comes time to make more chickadees, they are not eating seeds anymore. They switch to caterpillars. They become caterpillar specialists. And it's not because caterpillars are the only things that they could find out there. There are early season grasshoppers they could take. There are early season crickets. There are mayflies and syrphid flies and snipe flies and psychedelic leafhoppers and click beetles and caddisflies and saddlebugs and millipedes and centipedes and spiders and all kinds of other things, but they don't take them. They just take caterpillars. So if you're in a habitat where there's not enough caterpillars, you're not going to have breeding chickadees. Almost enough caterpillars is not good enough. So how much is enough? How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? It takes a lot. It was these chickadees that told me that. I put a nest box in our yard, and they came and set up house, and I put my camera up so I could take pictures of what they were bringing back to the nest. This is how you learn what chickadees are doing. And the first thing I learned is, yes, they are catching caterpillars, but I also learned that the male and the female are cooperating when they're foraging for the nest, so that they can bring a caterpillar back to the nest once every 3 minutes. In one 27-minute period, they brought back 30 caterpillars. How do they do that? By bringing back more than one at a time. Sometimes a whole bunch. They're doing that all day long, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Now sometimes they will bring back an adult caterpillar, a moth, but typically it's the caterpillar itself. All right, the next thing I realized is that they were bringing back a lot of species of caterpillars. In a 3-hour period over the course of 2 mornings, they brought back 17 species of caterpillars. Now keep in mind, chickadees are foraging about 50 meters from the nest. So if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have all of this stuff within 50 meters of the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to get their caterpillars. Now, why is a lot of species important? Well, if I had just 1 or 2 species of caterpillars in my yard, and it happened to be a bad year for those caterpillars, there wouldn't be nearly enough to satisfy these chickadees, and the food web would collapse. But if I have 17 species, or 34 species, or 134 species, and I happen to know I've got a lot more than that, there will always be some combination of species that are common enough in any given year so that the chickadees can reproduce. This is a perfect example of where stability, or where diversity creates stability in our food webs, in our ecosystems. Okay, if you go to the book and you look up how many caterpillars a chickadee brings back to the nest every day, it's between 390 and 570. Wow. And that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And they rear their young, on average, for 16 days. Sometimes it's 18 days. So if we get out our calculators, that is between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to make 1 clutch of chickadees. And chickadees, of course, are tiny birds. They're 1/3 of an ounce. I think that's 4 pennies. That's what 1/3 of an ounce is. What if we want to make a red-bellied woodpecker that is 8 times heavier, 8 times bigger than a chickadee? How many caterpillars does that take? And of course, we don't want just chickadees and red-bellied woodpeckers. We want titmice, and we want blue jays. We want yellowthroats and bluebirds and indigo bunnings and toadies and yellow warblers. And we certainly want our wood thrush, our cardinals, our hummingbirds. We want a whole community. These are all common birds, but they will not be in your yard if you don't have enough to feed them. If you're speaking about hummingbirds, what is the specialized relationship with hummingbirds? I want you to say nectar.
Somebody said that.
So that I can say no. Yes, hummingbirds need nectar. But you know what? 80 to 90% of their diet is insects and spiders. So you do not have hummingbirds to eat that nectar if you don't have insects and spiders. And of course, spiders won't be in your yard if you don't have insects, because they eat insects. And it turns out that is true for 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America. They rear their young either directly or indirectly on insects. And this is news to a lot of people. It's news to people who write landscape for birds books, because you can pick up any one of those books and they will tell you how to put plants that make seeds and berries in your yard. And of course, for a lot of birds, particularly the ones that spend the winter in your yard, seeds and berries are crucial. But when those birds are reproducing, just like the chickadee, they're not eating seeds and berries. Think about it. In the spring, the seeds and berries are gone. What are they eating? They're eating insects. And if you don't reproduce, you don't have birds for very long. 1 or 2 years, then they're all gone. So we need to put the plants that make the seeds and the berries and the plants that make the insects in our yards, or we will lose our breeding birds. There you go. No insects, no baby birds. All right, what types of landscapes are capable of doing that? Capable of making the diversity and the abundance of insects that we need to maintain even modest diversity in our food webs? Well, to answer that question, we have to consider the most common type of specialized relationship all over the globe, and that's the relationship between the insects that eat plants and the plants themselves. Now, I'm not talking about pollinators here. Pollinators are not eating plants. I'm talking about things like caterpillars that are actually munching on those leaves. You have to remember that plants really don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they have loaded their tissues with nasty-tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make their tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a very effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why in just a few weeks you'll look outside, it's going to be green. It's not because there's nothing out there that wants to eat those plants. It's because most of those plants are very well protected from the things that want to eat them. But we do know that insects eat plants, so how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, they specialize. This is a talk about specialization. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat a few of them. They specialize on one or maybe two lineages of plants that share a common cocktail of chemical defenses. And they develop the adaptations required to get around those defenses. They develop the enzymes that will store and excrete and break down those compounds. They develop the behavioral adaptations that allow them to avoid the compounds, the life history adaptations that make them appear at the time of year when the compounds are least effective. But it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for all these adaptations to fall in place. It doesn't happen overnight. Let's use eastern red cedar as an example. It, of course, is a conifer. It has been in our landscapes for millions of years, many millions of years, interacting with local insects for many millions of years. And yet it is protected by a toxic monoterpene, beta-thuyoplixin, which is very effective. Even after these millions of years, there's still very few insects that have been able to adapt to eastern red cedar. But this is one that has the juniper hairstreak. It is a specialist on eastern red cedar. It has the enzymes and the adaptations that allow it to eat beta-thuyoplixin without dying. And that's the upside of specialization. We can have this beautiful butterfly. It can eat a plant that almost nothing else can eat. The downside of specialization is that by developing all the adaptations that allow it to get around beta-thuyoplixin, it has not developed adaptations that allow it to get around any other plant defenses. So all it can eat is eastern red cedar. And the upside of that is that if we don't landscape in a way that includes eastern red cedar, we lose this butterfly. It can't eat oaks or lilacs or anything else. It doesn't have those adaptations. If you're going to eat eastern red cedar, you might as well look like it. That's what the larva of the juniper hairstreak looks like. Everybody see the caterpillar here? Right there. There it is up close. This is the curved line angle. It's another specialist on eastern red cedar. Got one right here. This is fun with crypsis. We love to show these pictures. I showed that to my wife, and I said, "Can you find the caterpillar?" And she said, "Of course." And I said, "Yeah, he's pretty easy to see. Because, you know, his red head is supposed to be against a red stem over here. He's backwards." And she said, "Well, I didn't see that one. I saw this one. But I hadn't seen when I took the picture." You can even blend in with the dead parts of eastern red cedar. This is the juniper geometer that looks just like those dead fronds. So this is another form of specialization. You're looking exactly like what you're eating, and it helps protect you from all of those chickadees that want to find you. But in today's world, specialization has become it's really become a curse, because we're taking away the plants on which many of these insects have specialized. We're taking them out of our landscapes. And nothing illustrates it better than the monarch. Actually, there are thousands of species that illustrate it as well as the monarch, but we're not measuring them. We do measure the monarch. We have the ability to count their overwintering populations so we know what's happening to monarchs, and it's not good. As of last winter, not this winter, but last winter, there were only 3.6% of the monarchs overwintering in Mexico as compared to 1976. 96.4% loss of their population size. And this is probably the most iconic insect in the world. The rest of the world's going to be mad at us if we let our monarchs disappear. Why are they disappearing? Well, couple reasons. The primary one is that we really have taken away milkweeds from that big breadbasket that used to generate millions of monarchs, and that is the Midwest. We've got clean farming techniques now that use Roundup-ready corn and soybeans so that we don't have any milkweeds in the fields. And you know what? If I were a farmer, I think that's fair enough. No weeds in the fields. But we also don't have any weeds on the sides of the fields. No weeds over here is not reducing the yield of that cornfield at all. So we're kind of Roundup-ready happy here. And this used to be what everybody called weeds. That's part of the problem. We're taking these common plants that sustain life of all the things we need, like the 4,000 species of native bees we have, our monarchs, and many other butterflies, and we call them weeds, and that gives us the license to kill it all. Let's call them life-sustaining plants or something like that, and maybe we'll treat them differently. Okay, it's not just monarchs, it's not just caterpillars that are specialists. Well, by the way, monarchs are specialists on milkweeds. We all know that. But beetles are too. This is the elderberry beetle. It only eats elderberry. The dogbane beetle only eats dogbane. The sumac flea beetle only eats sumac. This is a Korean bug, leaf-footed bug that only eats ash. So if the emerald ash borer comes and kills all of our ashes, we will lose this species. Dave Wagner at the University of Connecticut has just finished a paper looking at all the species that depend on ash, all the insect species, and he's up to 95. 95 species will disappear, and again, that's the problem, that 90% of the insect herbivores that are out there that depend on particular plant lineages. If we take away those plant lineages, we will lose all of those insects. The good news is we can actually use this knowledge of specialization to rebuild food webs right where we live, because we know what those food webs are comprised of, or at least that's what we're trying to learn these days. Let's use the white-eyed vireo as an example. This is we're going to use this because that's the nest that my wife found in our yard. And it was low enough I could set up my camera again and see what they were bringing back to their babies. And if I knew what caterpillars they were bringing back, then I could figure out what those caterpillars eat and what plants we need to make those caterpillars. Then we've just reconstructed a food web. So let's do that for a little while. This is the blinded sphinx moth. It is a specialist on black cherry. We do have a lot of black cherry in our yard. So good, they're making blinded sphinx moths and those babies get to eat. That caterpillar is the chestnut schizura, and despite its common name, it's really a specialist on viburnum. In our yard, that's viburnum dentatum because that's what we planted. Our yard was mowed for hay before we moved in. So most of the plants that are there are ones that we have planted or have allowed to stay after the blue jays plant them. And viburnum dentatum is the species that we put in. It's making chestnut sciuras, and the babies get to eat again. This caterpillar right here is the drab prominent. You're probably thinking I'm just making up all these things. You know, it's not that hard. This is how we do it. See those two little anal crow legs there, little projections sticking out the end of the caterpillar? There's only one family of moths that have those. It's the family Notodonidae, the prominents. And there's only one species of prominent that has a white stripe down its back, the drab prominent. And it's a specialist on sycamore. Why do we have sycamore? Well, when we first moved in, I put a cold frame. This was an attempt to be a real gardener in my backyard. And a sycamore seed blew in, landed in the middle of it, and germinated. And I'm not very fast at weeding things out. So it's now about 40 feet tall. And it's making drab prominence, and the babies get to eat again. That is the eight-spotted forester moth, a specialist on native grapes. This is the lunate zalia. It's another specialist on black cherry. So black cherry is becoming more important in this food web. That is the spicebush swallowtail. There's this little eye that's supposed to convince the bird that it's a tree snake. And it's supposed to scare the bird. Yeah, it didn't work. It's a specialist on spicebush or its close relative sassafras. We have both of those. This is the tufted bird-driving moth, another specialist on black cherry. So black cherry is really important for white-eyed vireos. But you know, these guys are hungry. They need a lot more than that. So let's put some black walnut into the landscape. Then we can have the walnut sphinx. We can have the gray-edged boma loca, the black blotch caesura. We can have the bride. These are all specialists on black walnut. We have native maples. We can have Plavodes inchworms. We can have green striped maple worm, the retarded dagger moth. Everybody needs the retarded dagger. native elms. This is the American elm. There was the four-horned sphinx, the double-toothed prominent, and many others. If you have witch hazel, you can have the mustard sallow. If you have violets, of course, then you can have our true fritillaries up north here. The problem with fritillaries is They overwinter as larvae. And what do we do with our violets in the spring? They come up in our yard, we mow them down. So the larvae that have made it through all those months of snow and everything else are on top of those violets when we mow them down, and we've just eliminated our senior moment butterflies. So remember, 90% of the insects that we might want to have in our food webs are not going to be there if we get rid of the plants that they've co-evolved on. So we want hackberry emperor, we need hackberry. If we want Cuculio asteroides, we need native asters. If we want the brown-hooded owlet, we need goldenrod. The hog sphinx, the Pandora sphinx, abbot sphinx all need Virginia creeper. The river birch dagger moth, believe it or not, needs river birch. Zebra swallowtail. You have zebras up this far north? Yeah, well, they need pawpaws. The only thing they're going to be on, this is the redbud leaf roller, needs redbud. Large pectes need sweet gum. The gray furcula needs native willows. Turbulent phosphilla needs greenbrier. And the orange tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the epilated dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the white blotched heterocampus, the oblique heterocampus, the red line caterpillar, the laffer, and many, many more will not be there if you don't have oaks. It's the most productive plant you can put in your landscape. Why do we want all these insects? I'm talking about birds because we care about birds, but it's not just the birds that are depending on them. We mentioned spiders eating insects. All spiders eat insects, or they eat other, oh, I see you shaking your head. Yeah. They eat other spiders that eat insects. Yeah, a lot of people don't like spiders. And you know what? I'm kind of one of them. When I was young, a friend used to throw them at me. I don't want them on me. But look who does like spiders. It's the second most important component of bird food webs. And of course, they're very important predators that are out there. We can't get rid of our spiders. We can't get rid of our insect predators that are eating those insect herbivores, because they're a large part of the diversity of the insect life that's out there. They themselves are part of food webs. And if we got rid of our insects, we would get rid of our frogs, our toads, all of our amphibians are eating insects. So are our lizards, so are our bats, and so are our rodents, believe it or not. We always think of rodents as seed eaters, because they do eat seeds when they can't find enough insects. But the reason these guys are all eating insects is that they're really good food. Pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef. And insects have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies that are loaded with lipids. Those are high-energy compounds that allow these little creatures to grow quickly and reproduce quickly. And if you're a mouse, that's what you want to do, because there's a lot of things that want to eat you. But it's the same reason larger organisms eat insects. They're just really good food. Skunk is digging up your yard to get the grubs that are in your yard. Possums eat a lot of insects. Raccoons eat a lot of insects. And even things we don't think of as insect eaters do eat a lot of insects, like red foxes. 25% of a red fox's diet is insects. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. Doesn't matter how big you are, you need insects. And even if you don't eat insects, you need insects. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. It's a bird predator. You might think, well, I can have sharp-shinned hawks in my neighborhood even if I get rid of all the insects. But no, you can't, because the birds this guy's eating needed insects to become birds. Same thing with a garter snake. It doesn't eat insects directly, but it eats the frogs and toads that needed insects to become frogs and toads. You can't take insects out of these food webs without them collapsing. So in fact, a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. And E.O. Wilson told us decades ago that a world without biological diversity is a world without humans. And that's why this message applies to everyone. People keep asking me, how do we get beyond the choir? This might be one of the messages we need to take beyond the choir. Even if you hate all other life forms, I presume that you like your own life. We're not going to maintain ourselves on this planet if we get rid of all the biodiversity that's out there. It's that simple. But what is happening to all those things that rely on insects? Now again, we're going to use data from birds because that's what we measure. We had the State of the Birds report come out in 2014, this year in September. It's not pretty. 230 species of North American birds now considered to be at risk of extinction. Used to be the California condor and the whooping crane. Now it's 230 species. There are 50% fewer songbirds today than there were just 40 years ago. Something's wrong with the ecosystems that support our birds. And unfortunately, those are the same ecosystems that support us. So again, we need to pay attention just from a selfish perspective. Now, why can't all this biodiversity that we need be sustained in the parks and preserves that we have. Right here in this 600 acres. Why is that not enough? And the answer is that as wonderful as these places are, they are not big enough. They're not big enough. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down to a small habitat fragment, and it can be a lot bigger than that, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Tiny populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why is that? Because all populations fluctuate. Good times that go up, bad times that go down. If you're a large population, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population and you're fluctuating, you often hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat fragment, and then you're gone. Unless you recolonize that habitat fragment, you're permanently gone. That's called local extinction. And there's more and more organisms these days that cannot get around in our human-dominated landscapes. Think of a box turtle trying to cross a major highway. It's not going to happen. Not with the salamander, even not with many of our birds. They won't do it. So there are studies all over the world, and some of them are quite lengthy now, over 100 years old, that are telling us the same thing. The natural areas we humans have left on this planet are not large enough to maintain the biodiversity that we need them to maintain. And unfortunately, that includes our largest national parks. Now we can measure what happens when we take away the native plant communities that all these natural areas were once made up of, and replace them with plants from someplace else. So I call a non-native plant a plant from outside of the local food web. That's how I define it. And we have measured this for the last 10 years in my lab in many different ways. We always get the same answer. Those are all controlled scientific experiments, but here's something you can do right in your yard to measure it. I call this my 12 by 12 experiment. That's 12 feet by 12 feet marked off and shows you how much area it is. And we get to control in our yards what plants are in that space. Now typically, it's lawn. You can measure the biodiversity in your lawn. Get on your hands and knees and count it. And then compare it to other things that could be in that 12 by 12 foot section. Let's compare it to a white oak. This is one that I planted as an acorn 14 years ago, which means it was free and thrifty. And it also grew, you'll notice. A lot of people say oaks don't grow, but yes, they do grow. In fact, that's about 25 feet tall now. And what I did was walk around the perimeter of that tree at head height and count all the caterpillars on it. And that's about 12 by 12 feet that area encompasses. And I found 410 caterpillars from 19 species. This is July 25th of last summer. Okay, very productive. And then I stood back and took that picture. This is 5 minutes after I finished counting. How many caterpillars do you see? If I knocked on your door and said, you've got 410 caterpillars on your tree, many of you would grab that spray can, try to kill them. You don't even notice them. You don't see them at all. And that's typically the way it is. All right, let's do it with black cherry. There's a black cherry. It's about the same size as that oak, 12 by 12. We walk around that, 239 caterpillars from 14 different species. Okay, let's go to my neighbor's house and count what's on one of his Bradford pears. I could choose from many Bradford pears because he's got 32 of them. Same age, planted, we both moved in the same month. And it's about the same size as that white oak. So we walk around that, we count. I did find a caterpillar. I found 1 inchworm. 1 caterpillar, 1 species on that Bradford pear. How about burning bush? He's also got a lot of burning bush. I walked around those burning bush 12 by 12 foot section and I counted and I found 4 caterpillars, 1 species. They're leaf skeletonizers, little teeny things that are not big enough for a bird to eat. All right, well what if I was just lucky and I happened to get a really productive white oak and black cherry and really unproductive burning bush and Bradford pear? Let's do it again the next day, July 26th, with another white oak and black cherry and so on. So this time it was different. I did get fewer, 233 species or caterpillars on the white oak from 15 species, only 53 in the black cherry, 2 on the burning bush and 1 on the Bradford pear. What we're revealing here is a pattern, and you can do this again 1,000 times. You will get the same pattern. A lot of caterpillars on productive native plants and very, very few on unproductive native plants. And remember, if you're a chickadee, that's not going to do it. That's not going to do it. I was driving back from Williamsburg last weekend, and of course the Bradford pears are in full bloom down there. And I got to the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill, and I see their lovely Bradford pear plantings there. Those are pretty old trees now. That's probably 30 to 40 years old at this point. So there we go. Do they have the right to landscape their yard with Bradford pears? Well, they would say, of course we do. But then if we look over here, turn our head to the right a little bit, we see a field, and I don't know how many acres that is. It is solid Bradford pear, and they all have seeded in from those ornamentals there. That's what an invasive species does. Now, did Sunset Inn have the right to take away the productivity of that scrub habitat and turn it into a species that makes one caterpillar? I would argue no, they don't have the right to do that. And that's the consequence of planting with invasive species. All right, how different can plants be at supporting local food webs? Well, many of you know we've been measuring this, and we're actually measuring it again in a different way. This is a list of the woody plant genera in the mid-Atlantic states. We've actually got a list of all the plant genera. It's on my website, bringingnatureHome.net. But this is just the woodies, and it's ranked from the most productive plants down to the least. The numbers after each plant genus are the number of species of caterpillars, the number of species of bird food that each one of those plant genera support. Now I say we're still doing this. This is for the mid-Atlantic states, and I come to places like Michigan and they say, do you have a list for Michigan? And I've always said, no, I don't. But now I can say, yes, we do, because the Forest Service has funded my technician to make a list for every state in the union and for every county in every state in the union. And it's going to be released. The National Wildlife Federation, they're having a big website launch. The final official release will be in January, next January. Although they're going to do some kind of unofficial one, I think in July of this year. So you will be able to look at that list at your county and come up with a ranked list like this. And I predict this is what you're going to find. Oaks are going to be number one. 557 species in the mid-Atlantic states of bird food on oaks. Now let's compare that to a typical ornamental tree from Asia, like ginkgo. We're pushing ginkgo these days. Urban foresters are pushing ginkgo because they say it's such an old tree, it will be able to handle all the weather variations that climate change is throwing at us. So we're going to make our forests out of ginkgo. Well, if we do that, 4 species are recorded as feeding on ginkgo, but I think they're mistakes. I think they're mistaken records. One of those is the cecropia moth. I will give you $10,000 for every cecropia moth you rear on a ginkgo. And what happens is, cecropia moths, their favorite host plant is black cherry. They will eat it, and then they crawl off as a 5th instar larva before they make their cocoon. And there's a cecropia moth cocoon on my back porch right now. It doesn't mean they were eating my back porch. They just happened to end up there. And I think somebody found a cocoon on a ginkgo and said, oh, that's its host plant. It's not. I don't know what the other 3 are, but let's say these are good host records. 557 versus 4. And that's what ginkgos always look like, nothing eaten out of those days. So we can create urban forests out of ginkgo, but we can't call them forests because they will not be supporting life the way forests do. Number 2 on the list is prunus, 456 species of caterpillars. So that's your black cherry, your pin cherry, your Chickasaw plum, your American plum. Very productive plant. Let's compare that to another Asian ornamental that we're pushing these days, Zelkova. We're pushing it because it looks like the elms that we lost to Dutch elm disease. No caterpillars on Zelkova. Nothing has been recorded on Zelkova. They all look like that. So perfect plants, and if that's what you want, that's what you have. A perfect leaf that is not chewed on at all. But it could be plastic, it could be silk, and it would be just as productive. It's not going to support any longer. How about foundation plants? Pieris japonica is probably the most common foundation plant we have in North America. We do have a native Pieris, and there's only 2 species recorded on it. I've never found anything on Pieris japonica. But it could be a native viburnum where we have 103 species recorded. Huge differences between many of the plants we do use for landscaping versus the plants that we could use. So I'm trying to convince people to think of their landscape, the plants in their landscape, as if they were bird feeders. There you go, they're bird feeders. Now you get to decide You can decide how many bird feeders you want. You can have a lot, or you can have just a few. You can have full bird feeders, or you can have empty ones. There's the ginkgo right there. Big tree, but it's empty. It's empty. So it's your decision. And you know what? We're not fooling the birds when we landscape the way we have been doing. This is a little bit of data from my PhD student, Desiree Naranjo, who's working in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. She's expanding our work on chickadees. She's following 90 pairs of breeding chickadees on residential landscapes. And this is what she finds. That's the foraging territory of a breeding pair. There's where the nest is. So again, it's about 50 meters from the nest. And these shaded blue areas represent 95% of the foraging effort of those two birds. The dark blue areas represent even more. I mean, so most of the foraging is in the dark blue areas, then less in these light blue areas. And none where there's no blue. So let's look at what those plants are. Hard to see, but they're all native plants. That's basswood, sweet gum, pin oak, willow oak, black cherry, American elm. Elm was the big one there. They really liked the elm. And all of their nutritional needs were met by those native trees. But equally informative is to look at the plants they are not foraging on. They're all from Asia. Japanese maple, silk tree, saucer magnolia, leyland cypress, crepe myrtles, our friendly ginkgo. And you can easily imagine a landscape where those are the primary plants that are out there. In which case, the chickadee family will not be able to make it. And again, if you can't support chickadees, you can't support anything else because they're such tiny birds. She's also measuring the migrant birds that are forgotten. We forget about those migrants. A lot of them move through at night, or they stop in the morning, and they've got to feed. They don't go around our cities. They don't go around all the places we've wrecked. They go right through them because that's what they've always done, and they come down because they're exhausted and they have to eat. She has found 51 species of migrants, and there they are, going through those properties. If we don't have the plants that feed them during their migration, they don't make it in their migration. So this is the unsung crisis in bird migrations, is that we're ruining all of their food supply as they migrate both north and south. So you don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you do have to consider saving biodiversity where you live, because we live in so many places, and the biodiversity around us needs those places. We don't have the option of opting out of contributing to local ecosystems anymore. There's simply too many of us. Let's talk about plants that make berries. Are all berries good for the birds? A lot of the invasive plants that we have, like buckthorn, like bush honeysuckle, like Iliagnus or ugly Agnes, whatever you want to call them, were planted because they make berries. The birds do eat those berries, and wildlife specialists have said for decades they're good for the birds, so we're going to plant them. Well, is that true? It turns out that birds and berries have co-evolved just like insects and plants have co-evolved. The plants that make berries are making them tasty so that birds will eat them and fly off and disperse that seed someplace else. It is a dispersal mechanism to produce a tasty berry, and birds are the dispersal agents. So the plants have done what is good for the birds to get them to eat these berries. In the summer, they're producing berries that are high in sugar, because that's what birds need in the summertime. They've eaten so many of those insects, so much protein, that they need some carbohydrates. So summer berries are high in sugar, and the birds love them, and it's good for them. Fall berries, like poison ivy, are high in fat. And that's what birds need in the fall, because if you are migrating, you need a high-fat diet to give you the energy for that migration. Can't do it on a sugar diet. And if you're not migrating, you're sticking around in the cold months, you need to build up a lot of fat reserves so you can make it through the winter. So high-fat berries are exactly what the birds need in the fall. There we go. I should have gotten rid of that first slide. Then in late winter, the birds are looking for berries that again move back towards a lot of carbohydrates or a lot of sugar. So things like winterberry, after a number of freezes, produce high sugar berries, and that's what they need at the very end of the winter to give them the boost they need to get into their reproduction mode. That is a co-evolved relationship where plants are supplying what the birds need at the appropriate time to disperse their seeds. Now, a woman named Susan Smith, who just got married, she's now Susan Smith somebody else. And she just moved to Cornell. She's got a job there at Cornell. has been measuring the nutritional value of native berries versus non-native berries to see what's going on there. And this is what she's found for fat berries. Now these berries are all produced in the fall. They're all native. So Myrica pennsylvanicum, our native viburnums, spicebush, our native dogwoods, Virginia creeper. Look at 50% fat, 48%, 48, 30, almost 35, 24% fat. Very high in fat. Let's look at non-native invasive plants that are also producing berries in the fall. Multiflora rose, less than 1%. Bush honeysuckle, less than 1%. Buckthorn, 0.5%. Ugly agatus, 2%. Oriental bittersweet, almost 3%. But they're all very low in fat. So when the birds need high-fat berries, they're getting these high-sugar berries. What's the consequence of that? Well, they're eating them for the same reason we eat high-sugar diets when we shouldn't. They taste good, but it's not an appropriate food for what those birds eat. So it doesn't give them the energy boost they need to either migrate or make it through the winter. And that's the pattern that's emerging. It seems like the plants from Asia are physiologically out of sync with the needs of our current birds. They didn't evolve together. I don't know what's happening with the Chinese birds, but maybe they don't mind. I don't know what. But, so when somebody tells you, well, I'm going to plant ugly agates because it's good for the birds, now you can tell them, no, it really isn't. How about buckthorn? Buckthorn is not only not good for the birds, it's downright bad for the birds. It's Rhamnus cathartica. That means the birds eat the berries and they throw up. It's a dispersal mechanism. So here the plant is taking advantage of the bird but not helping it at all. The bird, a half hour after it eats it, will throw up and the seed has been dispersed. But you know what happens in a buckthorn invasion. The entire understory becomes buckthorn. There are no other berries because that's all that's there. So all the birds have to eat are berries that are going to make them throw up. That's not good for the birds, believe me. So what we've done is move plants all over the world and create what ecologists now call novel ecosystems. Richard Hobbs, I believe, is the ecologist who coined that term. And what it means is that the organisms in our ecosystems today are just interacting with each other for the first time. Those are novel interactions. And what Richard Hobbs does not say is that that means they have not had the time to develop all those specialized relationships that I opened the talk with. The specialized relationships that are nature. You take away our specialized relationships and you have taken away a lot of species. So we have something else here. It's not nature anymore. You can call it a novel ecosystem, but it's an ecosystem with many fewer species. So, if species are disappearing from our local ecosystems, we might want to ask the selfish question, how many species do we humans need? How many do we need? And when you're answering that question, don't think about global extinction. Ecosystems function locally. So if your yard doesn't have as many species in it now as it used to have, does that affect local ecosystem function? I don't care if the species are still in the Smoky Mountains. They're not in your yard anymore. What's that doing to your local ecosystem? Well, it turns out the ecologists have been trying to answer that question for decades. 1955, Robert MacArthur, one of the most famous 20th century ecologists, offered this hypothesis. He said, as you increase the number of species in an ecosystem, ecosystem function goes up. Of course, that means as you decrease the number of species in an ecosystem, ecosystem function goes down. You can measure ecosystem function any way you want. Very tough to test this. You've got to manipulate ecosystems, know all the species, know all the interactions. So he didn't test them. He just called it the law of nature, and that was that. We've had the redundancy hypothesis, the rivet hypothesis, all kinds of hypotheses trying to describe what's happening. None of them were tested. But there were 3 teams coincidentally published in 2012. Long-term studies where they actually did manipulate simplified ecosystems and measure ecosystem function. And fortunately, they all agreed with each other. It turns out MacArthur was probably right. Very simple. As you increase the number of species, ecosystem function goes up. As you decrease, then it goes down. So, how many species do we humans need? All of them. We need all of them because we need as much ecosystem function as we can possibly get. It is the biodiversity, the species in our ecosystems that are producing what we call ecosystem services, all those life-giving services that keep humans around. We should call them biodiversity services. Then everybody would know why biodiversity is important. And of course, the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment 2005 has measured the planet's ability to produce ecosystem services. Hundreds of scientists from around the world, their unhappy conclusion is that we have already degraded the planet's ability to support us by 60%. I don't know how that can be good news. Every time we add somebody to the planet, we need more ecosystem services. But right now, every time we add somebody to the planet, we get fewer. Why? Because we're not sharing the resources. That's the ocean, by the way. That's not a recycling plant. Well, why don't we let all our natural areas make the ecosystem services we need? That is what we have done up till now. We have used the principle of our natural resources to support our unlimited growth. But you know, now we're just too many of us. We're everywhere. It's either us, it's our agriculture, it's our cows across the United States here. Only 5% of the U.S. is relatively pristine. If we save 5% of the U.S. In a way that supports species, we will save 5% of the species, and that's not enough. So, what we've done is we've turned the world into Gone with the Wind here. We have usurped the ecological function of these landscapes so that we can create the aesthetic landscapes that we like the best. We don't have the freedom to do that anymore. We need to raise the bar on what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we have asked them to do one thing, be pretty. And we're good at that. But I think we now have to ask them to support life, because if our landscapes don't support life, we don't have it, and that's not good. We have to ask them to sequester carbon. We've got way too much carbon in the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, a third of the carbon in the atmosphere now has come from the trees we have chopped down, not from the fossil fuels. If we put those trees back, we could pull a full third out. We don't hear much about that. We need to ask our landscapes to support pollinators. There is a lot of talk about pollinators, but if I asked anybody on the street, why do we need pollinators, the answer I almost surely would get is because they pollinate our crops. And they do. That is one of the things pollinators do. But they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Forget our crops. Suppose that somebody comes up with a crop pollinator machine, and that'll be next. What about 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet? You know, if we lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, we're going to lose us. It's that simple. This is not optional. We need pollinators. We need to manage water. We need to do all these things right at home. There's a family that lives in that house, and if they're not generating all the ecosystem services they need at home, they're going to have to borrow them from someplace else. Now, again, in the past, we borrowed them from nature, but in an unsustainable way. So where are we going to get them in the future? He's not going to borrow them from his neighbor, because he's not making any either. Probably not going to borrow them from his open spaces in his township, because if his open spaces look like my open spaces, they're golf courses, or they're soccer fields, or baseball diamonds, or simply mowed areas with a paved surface around them where people walk in circles. That's what we have back then. You know, we think if there's not a house on it, it's good land stewardship. It's an open space. Okay, but it's not producing the ecosystem functions we need. Let's say we want to make clean water right at home. Well, we have to reduce the area that's in lawn. We've measured it back east. 92% of our suburban landscapes are lawn. 92% of the area is lawn. If lawn made clean water, okay, but it doesn't. It makes dirty water because we put fertilizer and pesticides on it, then it rains and it all washes into our watershed. So we need to reduce the area that's in lawn. If we want to sequester carbon, we don't want just 10% of the tree biomass in our suburban landscapes. That's what we have. And we don't want to use short-lived ornamental trees like Bradford pear that are going to grow for 30 years and then fall over the ice storm and release all of the carbon they just sequestered. We need the big guys. We need the oaks that you have out here holding that carbon for as long as possible. You have to do that in a biome-appropriate way, though. If you're in Iowa and it ought to be prairie, you don't want to make a forest. That's not what's going to be supported there. You want to make a prairie with deep-rooted native warm-season grasses that are sequestering carbon in the ground. So you have to do it where it's appropriate for where you live. And of course, if you want to build a functional food web at home, you can't do it like that. That's my neighbor's house. He's got 10 acres. 100% of the plants he's put on that 10 acres are out-of-towners. They're non-native plants. It's mostly mowed turf. You can't see that from this shot. And there are those 32 Bradford pears. So why do we do that? How have we gotten here? Well, we've gotten here because we've come to see plants just as decorations. Why? Because they are decorations. They're beautiful. So we've gone all over the world and looked for the most beautiful plants, and those are the ones we choose for our landscape. These are the criteria we use. Is it pretty? Can it be a screen, an anchor, a focal point? But it's all about aesthetics. We have not considered their ecological roles at all. Because remember, we thought humans are here and nature's someplace else. Let nature do that. All right, well, if we're going to do it at home, we can have beautiful plants that also have food web value, that also protect our watershed, that support those pollinators, that do all the things we need them to do. This can be done. How? How do we do that? How do we produce a biodiversity-friendly suburb? Well, this is the most important thing we need to do. We need to put the plants back into our landscapes that are going to support life in between those isolated habitat fragments. Remember, they're all too small. If we connect them with biological carters that are viable, that can really support life, those habitats are not isolated anymore. If they're not isolated anymore, then the populations within them are not tiny anymore. So when they fluctuate, which they will, they won't disappear anymore. This is the single most important thing we can do to stop the steady drain of species from our local ecosystems. Where are we going to put those carters? I suggest we put them in the area that's in lawn. Because we have 45.6 million acres of lawn, 8 times the size of New Jersey. We're adding 500 square miles of lawn to the U.S. every year. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because lawn is a status symbol. In the old days, only rich people could have lawn. That's how the ball got rolling. Then we invented the lawnmower. Then all of us poor slobs could have lawn. But then in the 50s, we were told if you didn't have a perfect lawn, you were a communist. And of course now, you know, I see the commercials every time I turn on television. You need a perfect lawn or you're just not a good person. That's it. But you know what? We can change our status symbols. I went to Wyoming or Montana, one of those places, about this time last year. And I noticed they did not have big lawns. So I said, where are your big lawns? And my host said, you know, we only get 9 inches of rain a year. That's one reason. But he said, lawn's not our status symbol. So I said, really? What is your status symbol? And he thought about it. He said, big belt buckles. So I really think that's the answer. If we double the size of our belt buckles and cut the size of our lawn in half, and of course we want to build those carters out of the plants that are going to support the food webs we're talking about. This is what we've done in the past. We build our house, put in a foundation planting, a few trees here and there, that everything else by default becomes lawn. Let's turn that on its head. Let's build the house and now figure out where we do want turf grass. We do want turf grass if we're going to walk outside, and I highly encourage us to walk outside. It's the perfect plant to walk on without killing it. So plan where you want grass to guide you through your landscape so you can interact with other things. I look at where my neighbors walk on their 10 acres, nowhere. Never outside. But what if you want to get married in the front lawn? You need some grass there. If you want to walk to the backyard, some grass, throw the frisbee, have a barbecue, wherever you're going to use your yard, that's where the lawn goes, and then everything by default becomes heavily planted in a biome-appropriate way. How do we do this without it looking wild and messy? That's the landscape design challenge of our times. It can be done. It's a different talk. But if you convince your neighbors to do the same thing, of course, then you've got that connectivity that I'm talking about, which connects with the woodlot here and the woodlot over here. You've not only slowed the steady drain of species from your neighborhood, you've reversed it. They will come to your neighborhood. And I can say that with confidence because that's exactly what we've done at home. We had 10 acres of bareness. We now have 52 species of breeding birds on our 10 acres. I don't think we could cram another one on there if we tried. Because we put the plants back. It's that simple. How long did that take? You know, we've been there 14 years now, but we had 52 species several years ago, so it didn't take very long. It didn't take very long. And of course, if we do this in half the area that's now in lawn, we got 45.6 million acres, but let's make it the math simple and say we got 40 million acres. Cut that in half. We can create a new national park that'll be 20 million acres in size. We're going to do it at home, so we'll call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite. What did I do? plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, it's still less than 20 million acres. So let's do that. Let's take an area that looks like this, absolutely lifeless, and make it look like that. Notice we haven't moved out. We're simply sharing our properties now. We can take these square things. We can put some trees into this landscape. I mean, talk about sequestering carbon. This is actually, I should have included more of the house. That's a high-end property over there. And one of the reasons it's high-end is that it's a place you might want to live. And it's performing all kinds of valuable functions. And maybe you want to get rid of it, of all the lawn in some places in your yard. You can have a beautiful prairie-like setting that's extremely productive. Now this is a mulch sculpture. And it's celebrating the fact that you cannot use native plants formally. Or at least that's the urban legend. And this homeowner firmly believes that. But nobody told the designer of this planting in Indianapolis, this is a formal garden in the middle of a park in the city. Those are all native plants. That's the first year of the planting. And of course that's not true. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. This is a corporate landscape that is designed to invite the employees out at noon to get sunburned. It could be a lovely setting like this. And there's really neat research that shows if you spend just 15 minutes in a landscape like this, there are measurable medical benefits. Your blood pressure drops, your stress hormone cortisol in your blood drops, your cancer is cured, you don't get divorced anymore. All kinds of wonderful things happen. You know, I am not kidding. The research is showing that the benefits you get from spending time in nature like this, and it doesn't have to be huge amounts of time, are the same you get from intense meditation. And that has been shown to boost your immune system. It also restores your attention span. We are bombarded by information all day long. You know, I look at my students, they're all plugged in all the time. I don't know how they learn anything. You either have to process that information or you have to turn it off. But either way, it takes energy. So by the end of the day, we're exhausted. We can't pay attention to anything, including our spouses, and that's why we get divorced. But if you spend a little bit of time in a place like this, it restores your attention span. But you can't do it for 1 week in Yellowstone in August and expect that to last the rest of the year. You have to do it every day. So how do you do it every day? You either work in a landscape like that or you live in a landscape like that. So I'm going to add another ball up here. Call it mental health or physical health. If you put a tree outside of a hospital room, the patient gets better faster. If you put a tree outside of a classroom, test scores go up. Every time somebody does these crazy experiments, you get the same answer, but nobody knows why. We don't know why, but it works. You also can add 3 things to your landscape that may not be there right now. Surprise, anticipation, and entertainment. By surprise, I mean you can't walk into a landscape like that without seeing something you didn't expect to see. Or at least I can't. Maybe you'll see the spun glass caterpillar, which I think is the coolest caterpillar in North America. Maybe you will see the puss caterpillar with his cute little top knot. Come on now, how cute is that? Or the rosy maple moth, how beautiful is that? Or maybe you'll see this dead leaf that actually is a caterpillar. That is the caterpillar of the showy emerald, a beautiful green moth. Maybe you'll see the fawn sphinx. Looked out my bathroom window last summer, and there he was. Only the second time I've seen a fawn sphinx. I go to talks all the time, and people show beautiful pictures of plants, and they say, "This will knock your socks off. This will knock your socks off." That knocks my socks off. Now, I recognize my socks are easily knocked off. But it also knocks the wood thrush's socks off. Those, one of their favorite foods are these sphinx moths. So maybe you'll see a really interesting behavior. They're out there all the time. This is the red-spotted purple. It's a female. She's looking for a black cherry, because that's her favorite host, to lay an egg on. She lands in the middle of the leaf, and then she starts to back up down the leaf. She inches her way down, gets to the end, touches her abdomen to the end of the leaf there, and leaves a beautiful little egg. And she will do that right in front of your face, as long as you're not waving your arms. Just stand still for that 15 minutes. And then that restores your attention span. It really does. Maybe you'll find a foxhole, like we did in our front yard just the other day. And maybe you will find the little toy that Mama Fox has stolen from the neighbors, so that when the babies come out, they have something to play with. Maybe you'll see a Sphingia campa caterpillar. I show this to adults and they say, ooh, is it going to sting me? I show it to my 3-year-old granddaughter and she says, ooh, is it tickly? It is not going to sting you, and it is tickly. Anticipation. Throw away your calendars. You can tell when the seasons change by what is happening in your yard. We know when spring officially arrives in our yard when the woodcock shows up, and not before that. We get to anticipate that. And I come home from work, I say to Cindy, have you heard the woodcock? Have you heard the woodcock? No, no, no. Then yes. And you know what? That really renews us for the year. Because it shows nature is still working, despite all the horrible things we talk about, the woodcock still comes. It's a very hopeful message. We know that it's mid-August or early August when the white-lined sphinx starts to pollinate the evening primrose, and we know it's fall when the juncos show up. You can make up your own calendar. Right now we know it's spring because the toads are singing. You only do that once a year. Entertainment. Walked by this bottlebrush buckeye 2 summers ago, 17 swallowtails flew up from that single plant. You can't walk through a cloud of 17 swallowtails without a smile on your face. You can't do it. But does that mean your yard has to be 100% native? No, it uses them. When you get to South Carolina, it's the only plant in the state at this point. Why? Because it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Beautiful blooms, exfoliating bark, it's not too big. It, of course, is from Asia. What is it contributing to local food webs? Nothing. So what is beautiful and contributing nothing? Maybe a statue? Maybe a statue? But how many statues? How many statues do you want in your yard? You know, 1 or 2 is okay. But if you want function, everything can't be a statue. How do you know when you've succeeded? Countless ways to know when you've succeeded. This is what people ask me all the time now, is where have the lightning bugs gone? Where have the fireflies gone? They're actually beetles, that's what it looks like. As larvae, they are predators in leaf litter. Leaf litter that maintains some moisture. So if you have lost your fireflies, I'll bet you've lost your leaf litter when we clean up. Make sure we don't have anything hanging around. If you have Chemlon, you've poisoned your fireflies. If your fireflies come back, you're doing something right. You've recreated a functional ground level. If you have holes in your leaves, Greg Nace at the Pittsburgh Botanical Garden calls this holistic gardening. This is a shingle oak, and it has passed on some of the energy that it sequestered. Not all of it, but some of it. And there's life beyond that oak tree now because they've done it. So this is a cause for celebration. It is not a cause for grabbing the spray can. And of course, if you have breeding birds in your yard, that is a sign of success because you're not going to have breeding birds if you don't have enough food to support them. Now these are all reasons that have been suggested why we should use more native plants. These 3 have been aimed at me. Some people said, well, if you use native plants, you will appreciate a sense of place. And that's true. If you understand the biome you're in, if you're a good botanist and you can recognize the plants that should be there, the ones that are there, you can celebrate that. But I don't think anybody cares about that. I've driven across the country, I've gone into neighborhoods as I get gas. They're all landscaped identically. It doesn't matter what biome they're in. Nobody cares about a sense of place. So I don't think we're going to win it based on that argument. And we're not going to win it by claiming that natives are prettier than non-natives. We've got beautiful non-natives. We do have beautiful natives, but, you know, prettier? I don't think so. Now, these have been applied to me. I like native plants because I'm nostalgic for the past. I like native plants because I oppose change. I just want it to be the way it used to be. Don't I know that ecosystems change naturally? Ecosystem change is normal, and I should stop fighting it. I should embrace it. Well, yes, I do know that ecosystems change normally, but I also know we're changing them faster today than we can. We're changing them faster than the organisms within them can adapt to those changes. So that's abnormally fast rates of change. I do oppose that because it's causing local extinctions. I don't like native plants because I dislike foreigners. That's called nativism. I like native plants because I like ecosystem function. They're also really interesting. But we're not going to have an ecosystem function if we don't have specialized relationships that create it. And again, this is the reason everybody on the planet needs to like native plants. It is not optional to not have ecosystem. It's not an option to have no ecosystem function. You can tell I'm about done here. So we can get this. We can save nature, but only if we learn how to live with it. No more of this separation of humans and nature. And I'm going to leave you with one example of how easy this really can be. The residential neighborhoods in southern Florida have accidentally saved this butterfly from extinction. That is the Atala butterfly. It's beautiful as an adult. It's a little lycaenid. It's beautiful as a larva. It's beautiful as a chrysalis. And it is a host plant specialist, an extreme specialist. It only eats one species of plant, the kunti. It's a native cycad. And too bad for the kunti, it turned out that it produced a lot of starch in its roots. So the Seminole Indians used to use that starch as a source of food. When the settlers came, they taught them how to use that starch. Settlers said, oh, let's do more than eat it. Let's turn it into a starch industry. When they did the 1912 census in Miami, 80% of the people who lived in Miami put down starch gatherer as their occupation. And they did. They gathered all the starch. So kunti was eliminated from the wild. There were a few plants in gardens, but that was it for kunti. So of course, if you take away the host plant for the Atala butterfly, you take away the Atala butterfly. In 1973, we came up with the Endangered Species Act. There was a desperate attempt to find some Atalas so they could get some, they could call it an endangered species, get federal funds to try to save it, but they couldn't find any Atalas at all, so instead they got it listed as officially extinct. Well, about that time, the horticultural trade, the landscaping industry, discovered kunti as a viable landscape plant. It's a low-growing evergreen shrub that does well in the sandy soils of South Florida, so they started to promote it. And it's now a common planting throughout the Miami area, and it's moving north. And lo and behold, the Atala showed up again. Nobody knows where it came from. There must have been a remnant population in the Everglades that is now out colonizing these plants. But what I really like about this story is that it truly was an accident. They never got that butterfly listed as an endangered species, so they never got one dime of conservation money, which is good because we don't have one dime of conservation money. All they did was add a single plant to the palette of plants that are used to landscape residential gardens. And the butterfly saved itself. If we can do that by accident, think what we could do if we made conservation a conscious goal of landscaping. And I think that's going to work. Because nature has proven to be malleable, really resilient, really forgiving. It is not endlessly forgiving. But I think she's going to give us another chance. So thank you very much.